Well, welcome to this episode of The Square. As you can tell, we are not in my kitchen anymore. We're going to be transitioning back to the office over the next couple of weeks. There'll still be a couple of episodes from the house, but I'm really excited both to be in this space, but also with human live people. We're 6 feet across here, just in case.
Won't touch it.
6 feet across. But excited to be here. I'm joined by Samantha Flores, who's the director of Hugo and been on past episodes, and Pete Jefferson, who is a principal with Branch Pattern, but also has a background in mechanic engineering and building science. Really excited to be with them today. This will start the transition of us wrapping up our COVID-specific content. We still have 2 more episodes talking about design sprints, but after that, we're going to begin a lot of the topics that we had originally envisioned for the Square and thought leadership, though I'm sure they'll still be colored by the COVID pandemic. So let's start off with what we're going to be talking about today. So the COVID best practices report, which if you're watching this on the video stream, it's in the description below. There's a lot of information from the CDC. There's information from the government on what we're supposed to be doing. What does the COVID best practices report have that's different than all of that?
So when we think about the information that comes out of the CDC, it's really, helpful for us as individuals to understand how we can protect ourselves and then how we protect our communities by masking ourselves, by washing our hands, by not touching doorknobs, things like that. What we are taking is we're taking that information and applying it to the built environment. So we're really looking at how can we design spaces to be different but helpful and intuitively helpful to people so that when they're in our buildings, they don't need to be told you have to stand 6 feet apart. They just intuitively know that this is the distance, or that they intuitively know that the air quality is much better because we've enhanced our ventilation systems and things like that.
Tell me a little bit about how this came about.
So when we were, thinking about the situation that we're in, we're all at home, we're all working from home. We as architects naturally have the call to duty where it's like there's something going on and we want to help. And so we really started looking into everything that was coming in through the news, understanding our built environments, and really, taking a look back into history a little bit and understanding that our spaces, our buildings, our behaviors, they're all really informed by our health practices and health safety. That's a historical thing. We have a sewer system and plumbing systems built into our cities and into our buildings because it's a much more sanitary option than the other option.
Yeah.
And that's something that's just common practice and common standard. So we started looking at this and thinking, well, what standards are going to change? Our behaviors are already changing. You see someone on your side of the sidewalk, you go to the other side.
Yeah.
Our behaviors are already changing in response. And I think it's kind of fun to look back on history and see, what behaviors have changed because of past pandemics, because of past crises, even just because health, safety, and awareness changed. Something that I like to think about is the spittoon. It's, back in the day, it was everywhere. The spittoon.
It's kind of a random thing to think about.
Well, you know what a spittoon is, right?
For sure.
the little dish that you spit into. Well, back in the day, spitting was completely normal. I mean, everyone and their dog would just go around spitting. And you would see spittoons in restaurants next to tables. You would see it in entries. You would see it on the train. And you don't see it anymore. It's not a part of our infrastructure anymore. And that's because there were instances where we realized that spitting spreads germs. And just that one, highlight just made us understand that this is not a practice that we should continue. And slowly but surely we removed that. Thinking back into smoking, for instance, we used to be able to smoke anywhere. And then suddenly we started changing the way that we designed our interior layouts to have smoking and non-smoking. And now almost nowhere in restaurants do you have smoking areas. So our architecture has always kind of been defined by these human behavioral practices. And so we think that there are real opportunities to look at how standards might change because of this current pandemic.
So this is not a report that is solely from Hugo, is that right?
Right. So this report was about 100 different people contributed to this report. We had a lot of Corganites that participated for sure, and Hugo led the effort in this report. But we also had outside contributors. We had industrial hygienists, we had mechanical engineers, we had cost estimators that also participated, and we had behavioralists participate, and indoor environment, air quality experts that were giving us information as we went. Branch pattern was also a huge contributor to this publication.
So, Pete, let's talk a little bit about that. Let's start off by telling me a little bit about what building science is.
Sure. Building science it's kind of an umbrella term for really a lot of different disciplines. I don't know that anybody can say they're a building scientist because it involves aspects of architecture and engineering, but then also physics and chemistry and biology. So really building science we think of more as a practice that it involves all those disciplines. Really we look at, I would say, like three main things that we focus on. One is building health. The second would be durability of buildings, making sure that they're built to last. And then the third is resource conservation. So constructing them in a way that is healthy, long-lasting, and energy efficient. That's kind of the sweet spot that we're always trying to strike for.
What are some of the big changes that you've seen because of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest changes just overall is the invitation that we have to the conversation now. It used to be really hard at times to talk about building health and have a platform for that. That's completely different now. That is not an issue at all. In fact, it's everybody calling us now, what do we need to do? We've had projects that have incorporated a lot of good things and maybe didn't certify that they were healthy buildings in the past that are now reaching out to us and asking what they can do to get that plaque on the wall that demonstrates that it's a healthy building. But yeah, looking forward, I just think it's going to be a completely different time where when you start a project, you have to start with building health. How do you construct it in a way and design it in a way that's going to work for people long term?
It's interesting that you say that. Last week we talked to Jane, we were talking about the psychology of trust. And when you and I were talking earlier, you mentioned that there were a lot of buildings that had already been built, but were going back to get WELL and Reset and Fitwell certifications solely really for the building of trust with the employees feeling confident in coming back to work.
Right. It's most people aren't experts. Most people aren't building scientists or architects or engineers. So they need some form of communication to them that they can trust the space that they're going into. You can send them a report and something that's really technical. For most people, that's way above their heads and what they can understand. I think that's the interest, part of the interest anyways, in certifying is it kind of takes a really complex subject and then can narrow it down in a way that you can communicate it to tenants, occupants, and say, here's a third party seal of approval that this building is certified for health. So we see a lot of property managers and landlords and developers looking to pivot and actually obtain some of those certifications now.
You mentioned that you have this great platform now to kind of have these conversations. Why was that not there before?
Yeah, I think in the US anyways, we are a really litigious society, unfortunately. And when you start talking about building health, again, it's a complex issue. First off, most people think they're getting it when they construct a new building. We have lots of data that shows that they're often not. Something like thermal comfort, for example. When I would try to bring up a conversation around designing for thermal comfort, a lot of people would just dismiss that and say, it's fine, we have comfortable buildings, but they've never actually tested. They've never surveyed. And then when we go in there, we find out that like 60-70% of the people are uncomfortable in their space. So it's that data and that feedback that a lot of people aren't doing. When it comes to air quality, that aspect of health, it's probably even worse. I think a lot of property managers and landlords are afraid of knowing what the quality is like in their building there. And what we're starting to see happen is with IoT and kind of prices being driven down on sensors and technologies, people are actually starting to bring that stuff into their space themselves. I actually, on the shelf back there, have a really nice air quality monitor, but a really nice one now is only like $500. So people are actually able to take that into the space. But yeah, unfortunately for a long time, a lot of building owners didn't want to know because they felt like if they knew, they would potentially be liable for what's happening in their space there. And we heard that response quite a bit.
So now that you have this great platform, due to the pandemic, to be able to have these conversations, what do you think the next, big milestone is that'll contribute to people feeling safe going back to work?
Yeah, I think a lot of the things that we're talking about can help. Providing people with data, providing people with third-party certifications, all those things can be helpful ultimately, and we've been racking our brains on this. I think until we have a vaccine, though, people are going to have some level of skepticism and some fear, honestly, in going back to the workplace. I think that's the biggest struggle that we have is no matter what we're doing in the space, until that vaccine's developed and deployed, people are just going to have inherently some reservations about going back to the workplace.
Well, so Sam, then what is it that, what are some of the best practices before the vaccine happens and then maybe even after the vaccine happens?
Well, so in our publication, the way that we kind of break things down is it's not a notion of time, because time is a little irrelevant to all of us that are working from home. But it's really about, pre-vaccine. Then there's a time period where there's mass availability of testing, and then there's post-vaccine. And so when we're looking at different solutions, we're looking at what's immediate, what can we do today that's pre-vaccine that can help. But actually, what we don't want to do is just deploy knee-jerk solutions. We want to make sure that our pre-vaccine solutions are beneficial in a post-vaccine world as well.
Cool. So tell me a little bit more about some of the specific conclusions you guys have on behavior.
Yeah, so, obviously there are certain behaviors that the CDC is recommending. Wash your hands, stand 6 feet away. But we actually understand that people don't really adhere to those once they're in a social situation when they've been deprived of their social liberties for a little while, and they've been, working from home and a little locked up, or not being able to see their friends at school. And so what we're taking a look at is, really understanding how we can engage people, how we can give them information transparency. I think Pete, you alluded to that a little bit. Information transparency is key. And so what we've been taking a look at are some of the technologies that we've been looking at over the past few years that have been emerging, and seeing that this pandemic is actually a catalyst for a lot of those technologies. One of those is a digital twin. We're looking at the user engagement applications of a digital twin and how a building can operate and then, alert different people of, potential viral spread. It can also help us with, touchless accessing points throughout the building and help manage those systems, and also help us manage capacities in different areas. If you know that there's a 50-person capacity in the cafeteria space in your building, and it's at 49, then maybe you're more likely to go to the smaller cafe in your building or a cafe down the street because you'll be out in the open air. So really, we're starting to see how technology can manage those behavioral changes without forcing it on people, but actually just giving them the information so that they can be aware, they can take ownership, and enable themselves to have a healthier lifestyle.
So, Sam, two things that I saw that were really, kind of caught me by surprise in the best practices report were that with the plexiglass and the temperature readings that a lot of people are doing when they go into work, those actually you found aren't best practices.
So we think that there's, every building has to assess, and every company has to assess what they're willing to do. We think that those are both perception based. So when there's a perception of when you see the plexiglass in between, say an open open office work environment and you see them between the desks, you think, okay, well, if I sneeze or if someone sneezes next to me, it's going to capture it. I'm good to go. But that actually may not be the case. If you sneeze, you think of it as like a smoke plume, and once it comes out of your mouth, it plumes over and goes over the plexiglass. And if you have, ventilation right above you, it'll just take those aerosols and carry them throughout the open office environment. And then so you have to really be aware of the layering of effects. It's not applicable to, or it's not efficient to just apply wholesale.
Got it.
So you really have to take into consideration where you're putting your plexi barriers, or if you need those plexi barriers. The other thing with the temperature readings that you mentioned, there are a lot of buildings, there are a lot of companies that are selling the temperature readings that you can add on to the exterior of a building very easily. What we have found, and specifically to COVID, it spreads really easily when you're asymptomatic. It actually spreads most when you're asymptomatic. And so that means that you could come into a building, not have a temperature, and be very contagious.
Yeah, be spreading it to the whole building.
Right. And so to have your temperature taken before you come into the building, it's actually not helpful in any way, but it's a perception thing. So if you're trying to manage perceptions and that's your only reason for adding that, then that could be a possibility. But if you're watching your budget and trying to make smart moves, it's probably not a consideration we would recommend as a response to COVID.
All right, so then tell me some of the best practices you found. I think I read something about the touchless technologies, right?
Yeah. So we've actually been looking at biometric technologies for years in the aviation world. We have been, part of some studies testing it with TSA. We have been working in a lot of different areas and a lot of different equipment. We do think that regardless of if surfaces carry or do not carry the virus, that touchless processing is going to see a lot of acceleration post COVID-19, and that's because whether or not a surface has the virus on it, people are so much more aware of what they touch. This actually happened before COVID. People were very aware of what they were touching. People were, not wanting to touch elevator buttons because those are one of the dirtiest surfaces in the building. And so we do think that, touchless processing can be something that's a lot more beneficial for large buildings. It also can help with the security issues. It can help you access different points or control access to different points as well. And then we also believe that it can be tied into payment in digital wallets. So it makes it very, very easy to, if you work in a commercial building that maybe has a cafeteria or a cafe, to go down, access your digital wallet through your face or your biometrics, your iris scanning maybe, and pay that way without having to bring your belongings down to the cafeteria.
Got it. So Pete, if there was something that kind of stood out, and I know the best practices is reports broken up into kind of 4 different chapters, but if there's something that stood out to you as something that's the highest recommendation, what would you say?
Well, I think in terms of highest recommendation overall, touchless goes so far because it addresses the fomite transmission, which we're still getting kind of conflicting guidance on how big an impact that is, but let's say it's half of what the transmission's responsible for. Anything we can do to avoid touching surfaces that are shared by other people, that's a big part of it. I think about all the stuff that we impact and we're providing guidance on. It's way more complex than keeping surfaces clean and not touching them. We're talking about systemic changes in buildings overall. Maybe that's the other half of the equation, but it's really hard to do. So I think the touchless, to Sam's point, the folks that we're talking to, they're looking at that long term like we should have been doing this already. So I think that's going to be one of the big changes.
So there's some obviously really positive things that we're able to look at and kind of put into place. Are you seeing any negative things because of the pandemic and our response to it?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some challenges on our side when we look at what the research is guiding us towards. Not just for COVID-19, I should point out that a lot of the strategies that we're talking about in the building science world, things like humidity, filtration, outside air, bringing more of that in, those are things that are all shown to have positive impacts on reducing flu transmission too. So those are some things that we're seeing done now in response to COVID-19, but long term have potential benefit for reducing flu transmission too, which is really impactful on society in general anyways. It's just we haven't really realized it until some of the more recent conversation. I think the unfortunate side effect of some of that stuff is increased energy use, and that is something that we're grappling with there too. I think I'm personally concerned because I associate global climate change as a health issue too. All of the energy that we generate comes from some place. A lot of it is dirty power, which then emits not just CO2, but particulates in the air and compromises health for people that are the most vulnerable anyways. So we don't just want to throw energy at the problem. I think that's a poor long-term choice for us. In the short term, while we're dealing with the pandemic, I've kind of been using this analogy of we sort of have this fire raging and we need to put it out. So yeah, you throw water on it and you deal with the water damage later. But I think it's important to realize that we need to be thinking about short, medium, and long-term strategies too. So what we do today to address COVID-19, we may want to revisit what we do in buildings for long-term health, but also the energy resource conservation as well.
So as we start to wrap up, tell me a little bit about the Happy tool.
Yeah, so the Happy tool is actually something that we've had for 10 years, have probably underutilized it, but certainly not over the last few months. Happy actually stands for Health and Productivity Performance Estimator. So we originally built it 10 years ago because we were doing a pilot project with the General Services Administration, and they kind of challenged us and our research team to try and quantify the human aspect of some of these building improvements that we were making. We were doing them under an energy conservation project, but then we looked at the human benefits as well. And we were able to build a tool based off of existing research that looked at things like thermal comfort, ventilation rates, just overall indoor environmental quality issues that affect personal productivity and health, and then quantify that. And if you're familiar with the well building standard, I think they've done a nice job of elevating this conversation, but at the time we found somewhere between like 20 and 40 times greater economic impact based on quantifying the human cost as we did with the energy cost. So, personally, that kind of changed my approach to building design. I'm an energy geek at heart, but realizing that a lot of the ways that we can leverage good efficiency is through good health changed my approach. So the Happy tool is something that we've evolved and grown over the last decade, continue to grab new research and include that. Harvard's COG-FX study a few years ago allowed us to create a new ventilation module in that and look at something like cognitive function as a result of things like CO2 in the space. But yeah, a few months ago with the pandemic, personally, my news feed was nothing but people trying to sell something the first few weeks of the pandemic. And everybody was trying to say that their product or their widget, whatever it was, is the thing that makes buildings safe and eliminates COVID-19. And a lot of it was, most of it was unsubstantiated, but it did point out to us that the people that we work with are going to have to make some tough choices about moving forward, both for COVID-19 and for long-term health. So we built a new module within the tool really focused on probability of infection. Now, the research on COVID-19 is so new that we can't really build a tool specific to COVID-19, but there is loads of research on influenza A. And so we were able to take that and apply it and build out a new module within the tool. And the things that we're really looking at the most are humidity, filtration, ventilation rates, and recirculated air rates there. And so what the new tool will allow us to do is construct a box basically that matches the room dimensions that you're studying, the number of people in it, the duration that they're in the space, and what their exposure risk is, and then make good design decisions based on probability of infection. Ideally, you shoot for the lowest rate of infection that you can get. My hope is that people will also use this in conjunction with energy modeling as well. And I say it that way because we're going to release this tool to the public here in the next month or so, and that's how we really hope to see it used. So people are making good decisions for building health, occupant health, and energy efficiency as well.
So as you can tell, we are just scratching the surface on all the information that's in the best practices report. Fortunately, if you're watching this before 10 a.m. Central Time, there's a webinar today. The link will be down in the description, where you can hear a lot more about this topic. And if you're watching this after 10 a.m., then over the next 4 weeks, Samantha and various other people, including Pete, will be hosting webinars on different topics having to do with the best practices report. And again, all that information, if you're on the video podcast, will be in the description below. And if you're in the audio, check out the website. We're so thankful that you joined us. Thank you guys for being with us and sharing all your knowledge with us. Like I said, we're still going to be transitioning back and forth, so I think we'll have 2 more episodes in my kitchen, and then hopefully we'll be back at Corgan permanently. So thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.